All right, so we're diving into some pretty intense stuff today. We got a chapter from a book about narcissism in relationships, and it's clear you guys really want to get a handle on, how to actually spot this kind of behavior. And I gotta say, this book, it really does get to the core of it. It's not just like, here's the definition of narcissism. It's like, here's how this stuff actually plays out in real life, which honestly is kind of scary how relatable it can be.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about this book was, yeah, it doesn't just give you the textbook definition of narcissistic personality disorder, but it goes a step further and shows how people with NPD actually operate in the world, especially in romantic relationships.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important, right? We're not just talking about narcissism as like an abstract concept. It's about, okay, how do we actually recognize the patterns, the manipulation, all that stuff that can really leave you feeling, completely lost.
It's interesting because the author makes this point early on about how, we use the word narcissist pretty casually these days,
Right.
but NPD is an actual clinical diagnosis. So understanding the criteria, the specifics, is really important, especially if you're trying to protect yourself in relationships.
Absolutely. And let's talk about those criteria because the book does a great job of laying out some pretty clear markers of NPD. Things like grandiosity, constantly needing admiration, a real lack of empathy. Like, how does any relationship thrive when those are at play?
Yeah, and the book really dives into how these traits can be so destructive in intimate relationships. When you think about it, trying to build a partnership with someone who just fundamentally can't or won't acknowledge your needs or feelings is valid. That's a huge hurdle right there.
For sure. And I think one of the things that makes it so tricky is that the book talks about this almost like magnetic charm that narcissists often have, especially at the beginning of a relationship. Like they can make you feel so seen and adored in a way that you maybe haven't felt before.
Absolutely. That's what makes it so hard to spot. We have this stereotype of narcissist as being really arrogant and over the top, but it can actually be this really disarming charisma that pulls you in, like a whirlwind romance that just sweeps you off your feet. It's what the book calls love bombing.
Ah, love bombing. So how do we know if it's like genuine affection or if it's this calculated manipulation? Like what are some of the red flags to look out for, especially early on?
One of the biggest things the author points to is the intensity and the speed of everything. Like this instant fairy tale romance, with grand gestures and constant declarations of love, all that stuff. It can seem too good to be true, and often it is.
Okay, so red flag. Things moving way too fast.
Right. And the book really emphasizes that this whole manipulation is actually part of a very deliberate cycle, a pattern of behavior that's really damaging over time.
Okay, let's get into that because, the book talks about this cycle with three distinct phases: idealization, devaluation, and discard. I think understanding those phases is crucial if we want to recognize when we might be, caught in this web.
Absolutely. Let's break those down.
Yeah, let's start with that first phase, idealization. The book describes it as, this dreamlike state where you're basically put on a pedestal, you're showered with attention, affection.
Like you become the center of their universe, right? You're everything they've ever wanted, the missing piece they've been searching for. The book actually uses the term soulmate. Like that's how intensely they idealize you during this phase.
Mhm.
And that can be so intoxicating, especially if you've never experienced that level of, adoration before.
And then the other shoe drops
Yeah, then the devaluation phase sets in.
and things get ugly.
Well, what's really insidious is that it can be subtle at first. Those compliments start to fade away. You start to get these little criticisms, these digs disguised as helpful suggestions. You start to feel like you just can't do anything right.
Oh man, so it's like that pedestal they put you on starts crumbling.
Exactly. And it can be so gradual that you don't even realize it's happening. It's like the book is this chilling example of a woman whose partner, he was always praising her fashion sense, right? Then he started criticizing every single outfit she wore, making her feel so self-conscious and just completely inadequate.
Ugh, that's awful. I mean, it sounds like that constant criticism can really just chip away at your self-esteem.
It absolutely does.
Mm.
The book actually calls it death by a thousand cuts. Like you're constantly being undermined, belittled, made to feel like you're not good enough. And the worst part is, because of all that intense idealization in the beginning, you start to question yourself. Like, what did I do to make them change?
Which is exactly what they want, right?
Oh, yeah. They need you to doubt yourself, to
Yeah.
become dependent on their approval. It's all about solidifying their control.
And that control ultimately leads to the final stage. This is the part that honestly gave me chills when I read it. The way it describes how sudden it can be, the coldness, the complete lack of empathy, It's brutal.
Yeah. The author talks about how, once they've gotten what they needed from the relationship, whether it's validation or admiration or just a sense of power, they'll often just discard their partner with little to no warning. Like you're suddenly disposable, you
Yeah.
no longer serve their needs.
And for the victim, I can't even imagine to be left feeling that confused and worthless and abandoned. Like, what do you even do with that?
The book uses this analogy of a vampire, which sounds harsh, but it really gets the point across. Like they drain you of your emotional energy and then they just move on to the next source.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. It's a powerful image. And it really drives home why this deep dive is so important. We're trying to shine a light on these patterns so you can, recognize the signs and protect yourself from getting caught in that web.
Yeah.
Reading this, I was thinking like, okay, well, I would never fall for that. I totally see the red flags. But the book makes this really good point about how it's not always that simple, is it?
No, not at all. And, one of the things the author highlights is that often it's the most empathetic people, the most caring individuals who are actually the most susceptible to narcissistic abuse.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's kind of like they're drawn to helping others, fixing things. And so they overlook those warning signs because they just naturally want to see the good in people.
Wow, so their own empathy is almost used against them.
Exactly. The narcissist is really skilled at exploiting those vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And the longer you're stuck in that cycle of idealization and devaluation, the more your sense of self gets chipped away.
Which brings us back to why early recognition is so key. Like, if you can spot those patterns early on, you have a better chance, right?
Yeah, for sure. And recognizing the patterns is huge. But the book also talks about this tactic that narcissists use called gaslighting. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah. Gaslighting. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but honestly, I'm not sure I always fully get it. Like, what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, the way the book explains it, gaslighting is basically a form of manipulation where the narcissist tries to make you doubt your own sanity, your own perception of what's real.
So, like, let's say they're being really critical and you try to call them out on it,
Yeah.
and then they deny it ever happened or try to twist it around to make you feel like you're the one who's being unreasonable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The book gives this example. There's this woman, and she confronts her partner about something hurtful he said. And instead of just apologizing, he basically tells her, you're imagining things, you're too sensitive. And over time, she starts to question her own memory, her own perception of what happened.
Oh, wow. That's scary. I mean, if you can't even trust your own sense of reality, how do you even begin to get out of that situation?
Yeah, it can be really disorienting and isolating. And that's why understanding these tactics, being able to name them, is so important. It gives you that power to step back and say, wait a minute, no, this isn't right. I'm not crazy. This is manipulation.
So it's almost like knowledge is power in this case. Just having the awareness can actually protect you.
For sure. And that's ultimately the hopeful message of this book, right? It's not about like diagnosing everyone in your life as a narcissist. It's about, okay, how do we recognize unhealthy patterns? How do we set boundaries and protect ourselves?
I like that. It's not about becoming paranoid. It's about awareness
Yeah.
and
Right.
self-preservation.
Right. The author talks about how understanding narcissism is actually a journey of self-discovery. It's about learning to trust your own instincts, recognizing your worth, and refusing to accept anything less than respect.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important message for anyone who might be in a relationship that's just, causing them a lot of pain and confusion. It's like this book isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about giving you the tools to navigate these dynamics in a way that's, healthier for you.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting, even if you're not in a romantic relationship right now, understanding these patterns of narcissistic behavior can be really helpful in just navigating other relationships in your life too. Family members, friends, colleagues.
Yeah, that's true. Toxic behavior can show up anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And it's not always super obvious. Sometimes it's those little bigs, the need for control, the lack of empathy. If you can recognize the patterns early on, it can save you so much heartache.
Right. And this book actually gives some really good practical strategies for dealing with these types of people. It's not just about, okay, here's the problem. It's like, okay, here are some things you can actually do. How do you set boundaries, protect yourself, and ultimately disengage from these dynamics that just aren't healthy for you?
So it's like a guidebook for self-preservation in a way. It's not about trying to change the other person. It's about, okay, how do I change how I interact with them?
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that you always have a choice. You can choose to stay in these relationships that are draining you, or you can choose to walk away and create healthier, more fulfilling connections with people who actually value and respect you.
And sometimes walking away is the hardest choice, but it might be the best one, right?
Yeah, it can be really tough. But the book actually shares some really inspiring stories from people who were able to break free from these narcissistic relationships and, rebuild their lives. It's amazing to see the resilience of the human spirit.
Oh, I bet. It's so important to hear those stories because it gives you hope,
Mhm.
Like, even if you feel trapped right now, there's a way out. And it all starts with knowledge,
Mhm.
understanding what you're dealing with, and then taking those first steps to reclaim your power. I'm telling you, this book has really been an eye-opener for me. Like, I'm looking at my own relationships, and I'm starting to notice these little things, these patterns that I don't think I would have picked up on before.
I think that's what happens when you start to understand these dynamics. It's like you can't unsee it, you know? But it's not about being suspicious of everyone you meet. It's just about having a better understanding of like human behavior, the good and the bad.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that really stuck with me is like, okay, if someone is showing these narcissistic traits, it's not my job to fix them.
Right. That's so important. And the book really drives that point home. Like you can't force someone to change, especially if they actually have NPD.
Mm.
And honestly, trying to do that is only going to lead to more frustration and exhaustion for you.
So instead of trying to change them, it's more about, okay, what can I do to protect myself? Like setting boundaries, making choices that are actually good for me.
Absolutely. And, that might mean needing to create some distance,
Yeah.
limiting contact, or even just walking away from the relationship completely. It's not easy, but sometimes it's the healthiest thing you can do.
It's like this book is giving us permission to like put ourselves first, to say no to things that are hurting us.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we deserve to be in relationships that are based on mutual respect, trust, empathy, all of that.
And I think honestly that's a perfect note to end this deep dive on.
I agree. If there's one thing I hope everyone listening takes away, it's that you have the power to choose the people you let into your life and to create the kind of relationships you want.
It all comes back to self-awareness, right?
Yeah,
Knowing your own worth and being able to spot those red flags.
exactly. And even if you've been in a relationship with someone who, show those narcissistic traits, it doesn't define you.
You can heal, you can learn from it, and you can build even stronger, healthier relationships going forward.
This deep dive is just the start of that journey, so keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.